My name is James Marcucci, and I'm here to present my capstone today entitled Urban Forest Stewardship Potential for Social Housing Sites in Toronto. So this capstone project is based on my internship at LEAF this summer. LEAF is a non-for-profit in Toronto, and LEAF stands for Local Enhancement and Appreciation of Forests. So tree canopy and Toronto community housing. In Toronto, there's a measurable urban tree canopy cover inequality, which is positively correlated to median household income. So the TCH initiative is trying to improve tree canopy cover in areas that need it most. I'd also like to say that TCH is actually the second largest public housing authority in North America, next to the New York City Housing Authority. So what do we know? The literature on improving tree canopy cover in green spaces and social housing is nascent. There's a growing body of evidence, however, that NGOs conducting urban forest stewardship may exacerbate the equity of tree canopy cover by planting trees in wealthier neighborhoods. This is evident in Worcester, Massachusetts, where 3 NGOs actually replicated the inequalities they were trying to actually solve. So what about Toronto? This project analyzes the extent to which the TCH initiative has improved the tree canopy cover and biodiversity in the sites, as well as the social cohesion. The TCH initiative moves away from the top-down mechanisms that normally characterize these planting initiatives to a bottom-up mechanism that tries to improve the socio-ecological fabric of TCH communities. So what were the questions driving this project? 1, how is LEAF improving green spaces in TCH communities? 2, what are the obstacles and opportunities in these sites? 3, what were the experiences and challenges of TCH tenants? 4, what are NGOs doing that are similar to LEAF? And 5, how can we use stewardship to address the inequity of tree canopy cover? So these are my objectives. The first objective is to describe the state of tree canopy cover before and after the TCH initiative. The second objective is to determine obstacles and opportunities of improving the equity of tree canopy cover by reflecting on literature and the perspectives of key actors I interviewed. And the third is to identify forest stewardship challenges and opportunities from the perspective of TCH tenants through 2 surveys that I conducted. But first, let's look at the 4 properties I surveyed. The first thing I want you to notice is that all of these properties are on the outskirts of the downtown core in Toronto. These properties were analyzed because the data was readily available and the tenants I surveyed were part of each property. So for the tree inventory, it was done over the last few summers using the Neighborhoods protocol. This tree inventory measures specifically how newly planted caliper trees positively impact tree abundance and tree diversity on these properties. Now moving on to the methods for my interviews and surveys. So for the tenant tree survey, I ended up surveying 11 tenants, which was an 85% response rate. And for the tenant shrub survey, I ended up surveying 15 tenants, which was an 83% response rate. Now for the interviews, I interviewed 10 key actors. So ascertaining these perspectives permitted an evaluation of the TCH initiative from many different accounts to get an informed picture of how well the initiative is doing. Now moving on to some tree inventory analysis. So this graph here at the bottom is displaying the 4 properties that were analyzed, and the y-axis is the percentage of improvement. What I want you to note here is that for 7 Glenmorgan Avenue, they had the largest improvement in terms of tree abundance and diversity. So the light green is the native trees and the dark green is the total trees. And Scarletwood Court had the lowest improvement of tree abundance and diversity. So if we look at 7 Glenmorgan specifically, the first thing you'll notice is that there is a decrease in the most dominant species, which was Austrian pine. So there is about a 10% decrease in Austrian pine. And for non-native composition, there was a 16% decrease. So concomitantly, there was a 16% increase for native composition. Now moving on to the tenant shrub and tree surveys. So 11 tenants were surveyed for the tree survey and 15 tenants for the shrub survey. These surveys were conducted between July and October of this year. It comprised of 13 questions that were primarily qualitative questions, but there were some quantitative responses. So let's get into those. So for the quantitative responses, what you'll immediately notice is that LEAF did very well in terms of overall satisfaction and satisfaction with communication. However, a third of tenants for both the shrubs and trees said it was not manageable. For tenants that took care of the trees, we had one tenant have their trees vandalized, 2 tenants needed more help, and another tenant had water access issues due to construction. Now, the tenants that said it was not manageable to take care of the shrubs, these were for different reasons. Mainly, there were too many shrubs to take care of and too little tenants. Now moving on to the qualitative survey results. So what you'll notice here is that one of the more common positive responses for the tenant, shrub, and tree survey was the aesthetic improvements to the green spaces and creating stronger communal ties. One common weakness, however, for the TCH initiative was there's a lack of edible shrubs and trees, and there's a lack of financial incentive for tenants to actually take care of the shrubs and trees on the property. And the responses here that I've quoted illustrate how popular these shrubs and trees are, but also how pervasive construction is within this TCH communities. Now moving on to a couple of graphs here. What I want to show you is that the graph on the left illustrates the satisfaction. So blue is the level of satisfaction from like overall, and orange is the level of satisfaction with communication. And for the graph on the right, this simply measures the shrub to TCH tenant ratio. What you'll immediately notice is that for building number 7, which had the lowest satisfaction level, they actually took care of the most shrubs. So you had one person taking care of 11 shrubs, as opposed to the other buildings, it usually at least had 2, if not more. And moving on to the tenant tree survey here. So we have something similar going on. Blue still represents overall satisfaction, orange still represents communication. On the graph to the right here, though, is the number of tenants taking care of the trees in TCH communities. So what you'll notice is buildings 5 to 8 and 11 have a lower satisfaction level, but they also have a lower number of tenants taking care of the trees. So moving on to the interviews here. So first, the importance of TCH workers. The LEAF education coordinator spoke about the importance of TCH workers. TCH workers functioned as a way for LEAF workers to become the insiders within the community. Once they became the insiders in a community, long-term relationships could be established. Now moving on to how the TCH initiative cultivates placemaking. So in addition to expanding the metrics since the inception of the TCH initiative, the LEAF community manager also spoke about placemaking. So instead of the TCH initiative constituting a technical exercise of just improving green spaces, it can actually develop placemaking, which is a strengthened connection between people and place as a means to cultivate communal ties to green spaces. Moving on to the importance of long-term grants from the City of Toronto. So both the LEAF acting executive director and the executive director asserted that multi-year grants are vital. Long-term funding provides the stability to plan out the TCH efficiently. Moving on to the importance of measuring community engagement and having an inclusive framework, the board of directors stated how LEAF is focusing on giving agency to TCH tenants so they can be the decision makers in matters concerning their communal green spaces. The other board of director also said that having locally appealing messages would provide an inclusive dynamic framework by which TCH tenants can be engaged. Now I'd like to talk about evaluating success based on the TCH initiative as a short-term stewardship program. So the City of Toronto employees' assertion about the success of the TCH initiative is based on evaluating it as a short-term, year-to-year stewardship program. However, if success was based on the TCH initiative receiving long-term funding, then the initiative is yet to receive its full potential. Moving on to expanding responsibilities of TCH building superintendents. So both the TCH employee and the executive director from Green Venture iterated how important engaged TCH staff were. So TCH staff often came off as apathetic and unengaged because it's not deemed their responsibility to support the tenants, but this needs to be changed because although tenants want to actually improve and steward these areas, they may not actually have the support they need to do so. And this last one down here, tree and shrub planting effort commensurate with maintenance effort. This was from my interview with an urban forestry scholar, Dr. Christine Carmichael, when she stated that a lot of effort is put into actually planting these trees, but not enough effort is actually put into stewarding these trees. So these trees are quite expensive. A lot of effort is put in, but often what happens is it's very glamorous to have a tree planted, but it's not so glamorous to be constantly watering it every week, ensuring that there's mulch, making sure that there's no damage. And so that needs to be changed. We need to ensure that effort after the planting is commensurate with effort before the planting. So let's see how we answered some of these questions. In terms of improving green spaces, the TCH initiative increased the native composition between 4 and 16% and increased the abundance of trees between 7 and 21% on all 4 properties. For question number 2, the obstacles are ensuring the stewardship effort is commensurate with the planting effort, and the opportunities are to achieve long-term grants from the City of Toronto. Moving down to number 3, which is the challenges were illustrated through my survey. The challenges were that there were no adequate fiscal mechanisms. So basically they would receive a small bursary that would actually incentivize them to work on their own, because it was so small, it's not worth having more people come on board and then that bursary is spread out. So they need a more adequate fiscal incentive. There's disruptive construction, there's lack of edible trees and shrubs. So for this, LEAF is well aware that tenants want edible trees and shrubs. However, the TCH site managers believe that edible shrubs could lead to, rats being around the property and that sort of thing. But it is my firm belief that it's actually garbage and messy properties that lead to rats being on the property, not necessarily edible trees. And there's also just a lack of support of TCH superintendents. So if they're having water issues due to construction, often TCH tenants would rely on the site managers to help them out, but they were very just kind of hands off. So 4, compared to other initiatives, LEAF has done well not to replicate inequalities of tree canopy cover and cause gentrification. Specifically, green gentrification is when there's an improvement to green amenities, which results in change from less affluent people in the area to more affluent people in the area. And finally, TCH again, tenants were engaged and empowered from the bottom up. Question number 5, so the TCH initiative needs more institutional support with long-term grants. They need to target TCH communities with the lowest tree canopy cover and then to not intensify the discrepancy between different TCH communities. This leads to my recommendations. So for this first point, we noted how 7 Glenmorgan Avenue had the lowest tree abundance out of all 4 properties. This small sample size illustrates the most substantial difference was made in communities with the lowest tree canopy cover. LEAF needs to focus on TCH properties that have the lowest tree abundance and diversity. If LEAF primarily focuses on properties with high canopy cover, then they will perpetuate the inequity of tree canopy cover within TCH communities. For this second recommendation, multiple actors were interviewed, stated how vital long-term funding was for the TCH initiative. So long-term funding would permit LEAF employees to focus solely on improving the initiative rather than diverting their attention to secure funding for it. This third point here is about addressing planting stewardship issues entails understanding the social demographics of communities. The response from the surveys illustrated that current fiscal mechanisms disincentivize rather than incentivize communities. In addition, construction was reported as a major constraint to the success of vegetation. So intensive coordination is needed to avoid construction. There are so many TCH properties that it's possible to avoid construction and focus on TCH properties that do not have construction. This fourth point really amounts to TCH formally expanding their job responsibilities of TCH site staff so they can be incentivized themselves to support TCH tenants stewarding green spaces. Overall, the TCH initiative is a novel dynamic urban forest stewardship that is setting a precedent for how to improve green spaces and social housing communities in Toronto. And here in my acknowledgements, I'd like to thank Danijela and Tenley for their insight and recommendations throughout my project. For the interviews, I'd like to thank all the actors I interviewed. For the surveys, I'd like to thank the LEAF Community Planning Manager, Brian Millward, and the acting executive director, Aaron McDonald, for helping me formulate the survey questions. I'd also like to thank the 26 TCH tenants who participated in the survey. Their responses were invaluable. And lastly, I'd like to thank my friends, the MFC class, my family, my girlfriend Jasmine and her family for their encouragement and support. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, James. The external for this project, Brian Millward, is on Zoom. Brian, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Yes, I do. First off, James, congratulations on the project. And I just want to, send my gratitude to you for all the time and effort you put into the TCH initiative this year. Your time and dedication to this project was invaluable to LEAF. So thank you so much for doing all that. I did have a quick question, and we can probably talk much more about this project afterwards, so I don't want to take up too much time. But my question was in regards to sort of the challenges that you mentioned from the TCH tenants. You also spoke about how you had identified some other projects that had taken place that might have been similar or close to what LEAF was trying to accomplish with this TCH initiative. And I was wondering if you sort of found any solutions that might have already been addressed with these other programs in other locations that maybe LEAF could learn from to improve our program.
Well, first off, thank you, Brian. And to answer your question, I would say that LEAF is setting the precedent. So all my research in terms of stewardships that were similar to LEAF were in the US. The ones that did it best, they had very strong partnerships between the City of Toronto themselves and whoever's supporting them, but they also had partnerships with other stewardship organizations to ensure that they're being able to actually tackle this huge issue. I'd also say that in terms of like just trying to get over these obstacles, a lot of it had to do with ensuring that the TCH superintendents were on the same page here, because a lot of the issues that tenants were experiencing could have easily been resolved if they had someone supporting them, for instance, knowing that there's a different hose line on the other side of the building, just feeling like they're not the only person doing it. I'd also say that one of the largest issues for the shrubs was that there was just not enough tenants taking care of the shrubs. For that tenant specifically taking care of 11 shrubs, I think LEAF needs to ensure that tenants aren't being overwhelmed by what they're doing, especially, this isn't a job, this is something they're doing to support their community.
No, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I would like to make, no, we can discuss things later.
Okay, thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brian. Tenley, if you're on the line, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I am on the line, and yes, I do. Thank you. So I just want to say I enjoyed your presentation. I've enjoyed sort of learning about your research as you've gone along, and I think you did a really nice job of sort of exploring this program from different angles. So thinking about both the impacts for TCH tenants, but also, of course, then thinking about the way that these planting trees and shrubs is impacting the sites in terms of the number of trees and the diversity of trees. And so that's sort of looking at this from very different angles, I think really is a nice strength of this, this project. I have two questions. One of them maybe picks up a little bit on sort of what Brian was talking about with the challenges. And so you mentioned several times that the way that the sort of financial incentives were set up, that it didn't necessarily encourage multiple tenants to be participating. And I was wondering if you could identify what you think as some potential solutions to that. and I'm thinking both sort of in a short term, so imagining that perhaps there is not more funding available, is there a guideline that you think LEAF should work with that only a certain number of shrubs or only a certain number of trees should be planted per volunteer or per TCH tenant volunteer? And then maybe thinking more optimistically, if funding is not a limitation, how do you think the kind of fiscal incentive model should be modified so that you don't end up with one person feeling like they're overwhelmed with the responsibility of stewarding too many trees or shrubs?
Yeah, so if funding is still a limitation, instead of having one person take care of the shrubs or the trees year round, I'd recommend just splitting that funding in half and splitting up maybe on a month-to-month basis, or 6 months per year, one tenant takes care of it, and then another 6 months a year, the other tenant takes care of it. Because I think it's also not as much about the intensive work about going out and watering on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, but it's about the time commitment. These tenants, they need to be at that property to ensure that the shrubs and trees are being taken care of. And so if you could actually maybe divide the responsibilities up in terms of timing, that could be a solution. Now, if the budget is not an issue, I think it's a matter of identifying how long is it, or how many hours per week or per month is it taking people to actually go out, water these trees, ensure them that it's properly mulched. Once you identify that the hourly rate, let's say it's 5 hours per month, then you could say that, okay, so this bursary, they're going to receive this amount of bursary. So I'd assume that taking care of trees is maybe a little more intensive than taking care of shrubs. So perhaps there could be differences that way too.
Great, thank you. And I have one more question, and this is really sort of more asking you to speculate based on what you've learned from this project and the relationship between LEAF, TCH staff, and tenants. And that is that, as you noted in the beginning, there's a concern and I think a reality that a lot of private yard planting programs are really ending up planting more trees in neighborhoods where most of the housing is single family housing owner occupied. And so there's this real challenge of trying to reach properties or neighborhoods where there's multifamily housing, whether it's social housing or privately owned apartment buildings. And I was wondering just what your thoughts are on whether a program like this, in terms of the structure and the relationship between residents, LEAF, and the effectively the building managers, could be transferred to apartment complexes that are privately owned. Would this, be able to sort of be scaled outwards? And if not, what do you see, or why do you think this could be kind of shifted to other types of multifamily dwelling properties?
So I think the major impediment to scaling from TCH communities to large building complexes is the fact that TCH is owned by Toronto, and the City of Toronto has kind of a vested interest in ensuring that, because it's owned by the City of Toronto, ensuring that there's proper canopy cover. I'd also go to say that if we want to involve larger apartment complexes, they should actually just be amalgamated into single family dwellings, so that larger building complexes can receive free trees. So for instance, in Milwaukee, there's a Adopt a Tree program, but it only primarily focuses on residents who own a home, who are primarily white and have a higher income. So if you actually expand that, instead of only including families that are landowners, if you include buildings with large complexes, I think that would be a way to not just try and resolve or improve canopy cover in home residential areas, but actually trying to improve it in apartment complexes as well.
Okay, so it sounds like you don't think that this model would work as well outside of the TCH context, if I'm understanding.
Yes, on the basis that NGOs are identifying, Toronto community housing as areas that don't have as good canopy cover. I know that often higher density areas have lower canopy cover. So by that nature, I think the program can be extended to building complexes, but the actual organizations that are supporting the initiative would probably have to change, or, the city of Toronto would probably have to create another grant for large complexes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thanks for a really interesting presentation.
Thanks, Tenley.
James, I'm not going to ask you many questions because of the sake of time, but what made me thinking, this is a city within a city. This is Regina within Toronto, 160,000 tenants. Do you think that, it's great work, but I kind of have a feeling that the city is downloading their responsibilities to some degree to, from the city to the lift, to the tenants, and then superintendents are definitely an obstacle, by no means. Would you see this as an opportunity, as a job opportunity in managing these properties and engaging some of these tenants, even on contracts, to manage a few of these properties like this, as a job opportunity?
Yeah, 100%. So instead of kind of informally having LEAF provide these bursaries that are limited in funding, if the city of Toronto recognizes through the success of the LEAF TCH initiative how successful it is, then they could actually allocate some funds that would be maybe not a worker per property, but a worker per group of properties that are approximately close to each other. And so that way, instead of just expecting kind of like free or very low paid labor from people from each respective community, if we can assign TCH, one person from TCH who has enthusiasm for it to a group of properties, that would be a great way to ensure that these tenants aren't overwhelmed to take care of so many different trees or shrubs on their properties.
Thank you very much, James. Excellent presentation, very interesting discussion. We'll have to move on now.